It was Easter Sunday in the year 1478. Inside a great cathedral, bells were ringing. People stood close together, waiting for the holy moment of the Mass. Then, in 1 second, everything changed. A group of men pulled out knives. They attacked one of the richest men in the city, right there in front of the altar. Blood spread across the stone floor of the church. This was not a foreign army. This was not a war between two nations. This was one powerful family attacking another powerful family inside their own city. No king ordered this attack. No emperor was involved. This was Florence, a small city with no crown and no royal army, yet rich and dangerous enough for men to kill for it, inside a holy church on a holy day. This is the story of Florence. How did a small city, with no king and no army, become powerful enough for men to kill for it? And how did a city famous for banking end up changing art forever? To answer that, you have to go back to the beginning. Florence did not start as a center of power. It started as a small camp for tired soldiers. In the year 59 before Christ, the Roman leader Julius Caesar gave land beside a river to his old soldiers. These men had fought for years. Now they wanted peace, land, and a home. Caesar gave them this quiet spot beside the river Arno. They named the new town Florentia. The name means the one that flowers. It was a small hope for a small place, but the location was smart. The town sat on a key road between Rome and the north of Italy. Traders passed through, soldiers passed through. Slowly, the small camp grew into a real town. For hundreds of years, Florence lived a quiet life under Roman rule. It was never the center of attention. It was never famous. It was simply useful, a stop on the road, a small piece of a huge empire. Then Rome collapsed. When the Roman Empire fell, everything fell with it. Roads were not repaired, trade slowed down, order disappeared. Northern tribes moved into Italy. Wars, sickness, and hunger spread across the land. Florence, this small flowering town, almost disappeared from history. For more than 500 years after Rome's fall, almost nobody wrote about Florence. No great battles happened there. No kings visited. The town simply survived, quiet and forgotten, while the rest of Europe fought and changed around it. But history was not finished with Florence, not even close. By the 11th century, something new was happening across northern Italy. Small towns were growing stronger. They wanted freedom from local lords and bishops. They wanted to rule themselves. Florence was one of these towns. The people of Florence created something called a commune. This word simply means a free city, run by its own citizens, not by a king or a noble family. This was new. This was different from most of Europe at the time. But who actually ran the city? Not soldiers, not priests, merchants. Florence had powerful trade groups called guilds. Each guild controlled one type of business: wool traders, bankers, judges, doctors. These guilds held real power in the city. If you wanted a voice in Florence, you needed to belong to a guild. This was strange for its time. In most of Europe, kings and nobles held all the power. In Florence, a wool merchant could have more influence than a knight. A banker could have more power than a duke. The city grew fast. New walls were built around it again and again because the population kept increasing. More people meant more workers. More workers meant more trade. More trade meant more money. Florence was becoming something new, a city ruled by business, not by blood. Then the merchants took control. By the late 1200s, Florence had a system where guild members elected leaders. These leaders changed often, sometimes every 2 months. This stopped one person from becoming too powerful too fast. It was not a perfect system. It was not always fair. But it was a city built on trade, not on kings. And where there is money, there is always a fight for who controls it. In the 13th century, a deep and violent argument split all of Italy into 2 sides. On one side stood the Guelphs. They supported the Pope in Rome. On the other side stood the Ghibellines. They supported the Holy Roman Emperor, a powerful ruler from Germany. This was not just a political argument. It became personal. It became deadly. In Florence, families chose sides. Guelph families and Ghibelline families lived in the same streets, but they became enemies. Fights broke out often. Neighbors attacked neighbors. To protect themselves, rich families built tall stone towers next to their homes. From these towers they could watch for attacks. Some towers reached 70 meters high. The city started to look like a forest of stone. One young man from Florence watched all of this violence closely. His name was Dante Alighieri. Dante was a poet. He was also involved in city politics on the Guelph side. But even the Guelphs later split into 2 smaller groups fighting each other. Dante ended up on the losing side of this new fight. In 1302, Dante was forced to leave Florence. City leaders said he could never return. If he came back, he would be killed. Dante spent the rest of his life moving from city to city, always far from his home. During these lonely years, Dante wrote one of the greatest works in the history of literature. He called it the Divine Comedy. In this long poem, Dante imagined a journey through hell, through a place of waiting, and finally into heaven. He wrote about real people from Florence, some as sinners, some as saints. It was personal. It was powerful. And it made the Italian language itself famous across Europe. Here is the strange part. Dante never saw Florence again. He wrote about his home city with deep love and deep anger, but he died far away in the city of Ravenna in 1321. Florence had thrown out one of the greatest minds it would ever produce. Years later, Florence would try to bring his body home. Ravenna said no. Even today, Dante's body remains in Ravenna, not in Florence. The city that rejected him now wants him back, but it is too late. This fight between Guelphs and Ghibellines, this violence between neighbors, shows something important about Florence. It was a city full of energy, full of talent, but also full of danger. Politics in Florence was never calm. Power was never safe. And anyone, even a brilliant poet, could lose everything overnight. Then the city turned on itself. But out of all this chaos, something powerful was growing underneath. Florence was not just fighting over politics. It was also becoming rich, richer than almost any other city in Europe. And that money would soon change everything. While families fought in the streets, another kind of power was growing quietly. It was not about towers or weapons. It was about wool, gold, and banking. Florence became one of the biggest centers for making wool cloth in all of Europe. Raw wool arrived from places like England. Skilled workers in Florence cleaned it, spun it, dyed it, and turned it into fine cloth. This cloth was sold across Europe, from Spain to the eastern lands. It made huge amounts of money for the city. With all this trade, Florence needed a strong and trusted form of money. In 1252, the city started making a gold coin called the florin. This small gold coin became one of the most trusted currencies in the world. Kings, merchants, and bankers across Europe accepted the florin without question. It was a sign of quality and trust. With so much gold moving through the city, banking families grew powerful. Two names stood above the rest, the Bardi family and the Peruzzi family. These families did not just keep money safe. They lent huge amounts of money to kings and queens across Europe. One of their biggest customers was the King of England. The king needed money to pay for wars, especially his long war against France. The Bardi and Peruzzi families lent him massive sums. For a while this seemed like a brilliant business deal. Florence, a city with no army of its own, was funding the wars of powerful kings. But there was a serious risk hiding inside this success. Then the money disappeared. In the 1340s, the King of England could not pay back his loans. The war was too expensive. The king simply stopped paying. This was a disaster for Florence. The Bardi and Peruzzi banks had lent so much money to one king that his failure to pay brought their entire businesses down. Both banking families collapsed. Thousands of people in Florence lost their savings. It was a hard lesson. Florence had built its power on money, not on land or armies. But money can disappear just as fast as it appears. One king's broken promise could shake an entire city. And just when Florence needed time to recover from this financial disaster, something far worse was already crossing the sea toward its ports. In the year 1348, a new enemy arrived in Florence. This enemy did not carry a sword. It did not ask for gold. It came silently, hidden inside the bodies of rats and fleas traveling on trade ships from the east. It was the plague. People called it the Black Death. The sickness moved fast through the crowded streets of Florence. At first, people did not understand what was happening. Then the signs became clear: high fever, dark swellings on the skin, and death within days. Doctors had no real cure. Prayers did not stop it. Fear spread even faster than the disease itself. Families locked their doors. Some people ran to the countryside, hoping to escape. Others stayed and cared for the sick, only to become sick themselves. Bodies filled the streets faster than they could be buried. In some parts of the city, there were not enough living people left to bury the dead. Historians believe that more than half of the people in Florence died within just a few months. Think about that. Out of every 2 people you knew, one of them would be gone by the end of the year. This was not a small tragedy. This was a city brought to its knees. A young writer named Giovanni Boccaccio lived through this terrible time. Later, he wrote a famous book called The Decameron. In this story, 10 young people leave the dying city and hide in the countryside. To pass the time, they tell stories to each other, stories about love, about tricks, about human nature. Boccaccio's book gave the world a picture of Florence at its darkest hour, and also showed how people tried to hold on to hope and humanity, even during disaster. The plague did not just kill people, it broke the economy, it broke families, it broke the normal order of daily life. Workers were suddenly rare, so wages went up for those who survived. Old social rules started to weaken. Nothing about the city would ever be quite the same again. Then God broke them in half. If Florence had already survived civil war between rival families, it had already survived the collapse of its biggest banks. Now it had survived a disease that killed more than half of its people. Somehow, this city kept finding a way to rebuild itself. And from the ashes of all this destruction, one family was about to rise higher than any family before them, not through war and not through royal blood, but through something Florence understood better than anyone: money. By the early 1400s, a new banking family started gaining power in Florence. Their name was Medici. The most important figure in this rise was a man named Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo was smart, careful, and extremely wealthy. His family bank became the largest and most trusted bank in all of Europe. Popes, kings, and nobles all did business with the Medici Bank. Money flowed through Cosimo's hands from every direction. But Cosimo did not want to be seen as a king. He understood something important about Florence. The people of this city were proud of their republic. They did not want another ruler telling them what to do, so Cosimo played a careful game. He never took a royal title, he never wore a crown. Instead, he worked quietly behind the scenes. He placed loyal friends into important city positions. He used his massive wealth to control elections and decisions. On paper, Florence was still a republic run by its citizens. In reality, very little happened in the city without Cosimo's approval. This was a new kind of power, power built on money and influence, not on armies or bloodlines. Cosimo also understood something else. He believed that beautiful buildings and beautiful art could make his family and his city look great and permanent. He paid for churches, libraries, and public buildings across Florence. He supported artists and thinkers. He collected ancient Greek and Roman texts, helping bring old knowledge back to life. The people of Florence noticed his generosity. They gave him a special title, not an official government title, but a title of deep respect. They called him Pater Patriae, which means Father of the Nation. Here is the surprising part. Cosimo de' Medici ruled the most powerful city in Italy for decades, yet he never held an official political office of real power. No crown, no throne, just money, patience, and careful influence. Then art became a weapon. Cosimo understood that beauty could build loyalty. A stunning church, a great painting, a grand library, these things made citizens proud of their city and proud of the family who paid for them. Art was not just decoration in Florence, it was a tool. It became a way to show power without ever needing a sword. This idea would grow even stronger under Cosimo's grandson, a man who would take Florence to the height of its glory, and also very nearly to its destruction. His name was Lorenzo de' Medici. History remembers him by a grander name, Lorenzo il Magnifico, which means Lorenzo the Magnificent. Lorenzo took control of Florence in 1469, continuing his family's quiet grip on power. But Lorenzo was different from his grandfather in one big way. He loved art and beauty with real passion, not just as a political tool, but as a personal joy. Under Lorenzo's support, Florence became the beating heart of a movement we now call the Renaissance. This word means rebirth. Artists, writers, and thinkers across the city began looking back at ancient Greek and Roman ideas, mixing them with new techniques and new ways of seeing the world. Lorenzo supported many brilliant artists. He helped the young painter Sandro Botticelli, whose paintings of graceful figures and flowing movement became some of the most famous images in Western art. Lorenzo also recognized talent in a very young sculptor and painter, a boy who would later become known simply as Michelangelo. This teenager lived for a time inside the Medici household, surrounded by ancient statues and brilliant minds, learning and growing under Lorenzo's protection. Florence under Lorenzo was not just rich, it was beautiful, creative, and admired across all of Europe. Kings and popes sent letters to Lorenzo, seeking his advice and his friendship. It seemed like nothing could threaten the Medici family's grip on the city. But powerful families always have enemies, and in Florence, hatred often grew inside the same social circles as friendship. One rival family, the Pazzi, grew deeply jealous of Medici power. They wanted control of Florence for themselves, working secretly, some say even with support from a pope who resented Medici influence. The Pazzi family planned something drastic. They planned to remove Lorenzo permanently. Now you understand the beginning of this story. That attack inside the cathedral on Easter Sunday in 1478, that was the Pazzi conspiracy. Attackers rushed forward with knives during the church service, aiming for both Lorenzo and his younger brother Giuliano. Giuliano did not survive. He was stabbed many times and died on the cathedral floor. Lorenzo, though wounded, managed to escape. He ran into a side room of the cathedral and locked the door behind him, his blood dripping onto the stone floor, his heart pounding, his brother already dead just meters away. Here is the twist that shocked the conspirators. Instead of weakening the Medici family, the attack made Lorenzo stronger. The people of Florence were horrified by the violence inside their holy cathedral. They turned against the Pazzi family with fierce anger. Members of the conspiracy were hunted down and executed, some hanging from the windows of government buildings for the public to see. Lorenzo survived, and his position in Florence became even more secure than before. Sympathy and public anger had done what soldiers could not. They had cemented Medici control over the city. Then a monk lit a fire. Lorenzo continued ruling Florence for years after the attack, guiding the city through its most creative and celebrated period. Art, poetry, and philosophy flourished under his protection. Florence stood as a shining example of what wealth, ambition, and beauty could build together. But Lorenzo was not immortal, and when he finally died in 1492, the golden age he had created began to crack. Florence was about to enter one of the strangest and most frightening chapters in its long history, a time when a single preacher would convince an entire city to burn its own art in the streets. After Lorenzo de' Medici died in 1492, his son took control of Florence. But this new leader did not have his father's skill. He did not have his father's wisdom. He made poor decisions, especially when a powerful French army marched into Italy just 2 years later. The people of Florence grew angry. They felt weak and unprotected. In 1494, they rose up and forced the Medici family to flee the city. After 60 years of quiet control, the Medici grip on Florence suddenly broke. Into this gap of power stepped a very different kind of leader. He was not a banker. He was not from a noble family. He was a monk dressed in simple robes with a burning voice and fierce eyes. His name was Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola preached loudly against sin, against luxury, and against the excessive art and wealth of the Medici years. He told the people of Florence that God was angry with them. He warned of coming punishment if they did not change their ways. Many people believed him completely. Fear spread through the city like a fever. Savonarola convinced citizens to bring their treasures into the main square. Paintings, expensive clothing, mirrors, books, and jewelry, anything considered a symbol of vanity or sin, was thrown into massive piles. Then, with the whole city watching, these piles were set on fire. People called this event the bonfire of the vanities. Beautiful works of art, some created by Florence's greatest painters, burned to ashes in the city square. Objects that took years to create disappeared in minutes. For a few years, Savonarola held incredible power over Florence, more power than any monk should have had. But his strict rules and constant warnings began to frustrate people. He also made a dangerous enemy, the Pope in Rome, who eventually banned him from preaching and then excommunicated him completely. Public opinion in Florence started turning against Savonarola. Hunger, political troubles, and simple exhaustion wore down his support. Finally, in May of 1498, city leaders arrested him. Here is the shocking twist. Savonarola, the man who once burned art and treasures in the public square for being sinful, was now put on trial himself. He was tortured until he confessed to false crimes. Then, in the very same square where he once lit his famous bonfire, Savonarola was hanged and burned. The man who destroyed beauty in the name of God was destroyed himself in the same fire in the same place. Then the Medici came back. Florence tried to govern itself as a republic again after Savonarola's death, without kings, without a single powerful family running everything from the shadows. But this period of independence did not last forever. Political struggles, wars across Italy, and pressure from powerful outside forces slowly pushed the city back toward its old pattern. In the following years, the Medici family found their way back into power in Florence again and again, through different branches of the family, through military support, and through careful political alliances. Eventually, the family's position changed completely. They were no longer just bankers hiding behind a republic. In 1532, a member of the Medici family became the official Duke of Florence. Later, the family gained an even bigger title, Grand Duke of Tuscany. The Medici, who once ruled quietly from behind the curtain, now ruled openly, wearing crowns, sitting on real thrones. But something important had changed. Florence was no longer the center of European power and finance that it had been in earlier centuries. Other cities and other nations grew stronger. New trade routes across the ocean shifted wealth toward places like Spain, Portugal, and later England. Florence still mattered, but it was no longer the beating heart of Europe's economy. What Florence kept, however, was something even more lasting than gold. It kept its art. It kept its buildings. It kept the legacy of everything created during those intense, dangerous, brilliant centuries. Over time, the Medici family line ended. Florence eventually became part of a larger, unified Italy in the 19th century. The wars, the family conflicts, the banking empires, all of that slowly faded into the pages of history books. Yet here is a fact worth pausing on. Modern Florence is not a huge city. Many cities around the world today are far bigger, with much larger populations. But almost nowhere else on earth holds as much concentrated art, history, and architectural beauty in such a small space. Step into its streets, and you walk past buildings and artworks that changed the entire direction of human culture. Every year, millions of travelers walk through Florence. They stand beneath Brunelleschi's massive dome, rising over the cathedral where Giuliano de' Medici once died. They stare at Michelangelo's powerful statue of David. They walk through galleries filled with Botticelli's graceful paintings. They are walking through the physical memory of everything this city built and everything it survived. But Florence never really left. Let's return to where we began. A church full of worshippers, bells ringing. Then sudden violence, a powerful man attacked at the altar, blood on holy ground. That man was targeted because of something unusual. He was not attacked for wearing a crown. He was not attacked for commanding an army. He was attacked because his family had built a different kind of empire, an empire made of gold coins, loans, paintings, and marble statues. Florence built an empire, not with swords, but with money and art. This single idea explains almost everything about this city's strange and remarkable story. Wool merchants and bankers created wealth without kings. That wealth built towers, and then it built beautiful churches. That wealth funded artists, and it also funded assassins. Florence rose through trade, nearly collapsed from plague, tore itself apart in civil war, burned its own treasures in fear, and still, somehow, kept creating some of the most beautiful art the world has ever known. No other city in history quite matches this pattern: extreme wealth, extreme violence, and extreme beauty, all packed into such a small space, all within just a few centuries. A city does not need a crown to rule the world. Sometimes all it needs is beauty,